Hi, this is Kevin Kotz again, and what we're going to talk about today is Roman historiography. And we're going to do this by looking at a few of the more famous Roman historians, Polybius, Sallust, Livy, and Lucian. And what we'll do is the same thing that we did before. I first want to start off giving you just a general overview of what's going on with Roman historiography. And what I want you to do with this is to think about how the Greeks actually wrote history as well, so that we can start comparing these. And we'll do this again next week with the early Christians. So for one, the Romans believed that if you're going to write history, you must tell the truth. All the Roman historians wrote in a narrative form, and if you remember, the ancient Greeks also did this, but what they were writing against was the Iliad, which was oral poetry. So that switched so that the historians start writing in narrative. One difference between the Greek and the Roman historians is that, and I'm sure that you've noticed this as you're reading through the Roman historians, is that morality seems to be the big issue in terms of driving the story of history throughout their histories. So what I'm talking about here is that people are seen as being corrupt in Roman history, and this changes what they end up doing. And as you can see on the note I put up here, it's especially with the 1st century BC and the civil wars that were going on in the 1st century BC because of greed and the desire of power. And what really is what they're talking about is that this is happening with the expansion of the Roman civilization, and when it finally got to its borders, the limits of its borders, then it started causing people to want to have more control, more greed, and so on. A general trend you do see in the Roman historians is that the past is much more glorious than the present. And again, this is an issue talking about morality, so these are all tied with this. Another similarity between the Greeks and the Romans is they write in big man history. So we're talking about the consuls who were the leaders, the famous generals, and so on. And another similarity between the Greeks and the Romans is that the Romans also had a hard time with chronology. And in the next slide, I will talk a little bit about some of the things that the Romans ended up doing to have almost a better way of keeping track of time. And one of the ways that they had an easier way of keeping track of time was something called the Annals Maximi. And what this was, it was a way for them to keep track of, as I put up here, high officials, dates for religious functions, deaths, notes of what happened, year after year events, almost like an annal. So they had this big list that they could try and connect other things that were happening. You also had the years of the consuls, and this is the way that the Romans partially kept track of time. So what happened after, well, we don't know the exact date for Roman history, but according to tradition, 509 is when the Roman Republic started, 509 BC. And what happened after this is that the Romans elected 2 people to rule them, and these were the consuls. So what they ended up doing is dating the years by the years of the consul. So it would be year 1 of Consul Kevin, year 2, year 3, year 5. And when that consul died, then you'd have another consul, and it'd start at year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or so on, however long that these people ruled. So you do sort of get that, but of course you can imagine that leads to lots of issues. There are other earlier Roman historians out there, but we just don't have a lot of their texts. And one is a man named Fabius Pictor, who was living around 272 BC. And I've given you here some of the material that I think was important when you think about what Fabius Pictor was doing. So he wrote Roman histories in Greek, and this is much like what Polybius ended up doing. He, excuse me, he was a soldier, took part in the Punic War, and he wrote an annal, which is a year-by-year account. And he was also one of the earlier historians that we know of to put morality into the writing of history. Another thing he ended up doing is writing about the Senate, which of course is big man history. And again, we don't have a lot of Fabius Pictor's writings, but later historians mention him and copy out some of what he had to say. Okay, so Polybius was the first historian that I had you read, and I give you here his dates, about 200 to about 118 BC. He has a really interesting history. So he was a Greek, and he was involved in the Roman takeover of Greece. And so he was on the wrong side, and what Rome ended up doing is taking a bunch of people back into Rome from Greece, and Polybius happened to be one of them. He was highly educated, and he came to notice, or the Romans noticed him, and he ended up moving up pretty quickly in terms of the Roman hierarchy, and became friends with a very famous family, the Scipio family, in particular with Publius Scipio. And if you remember your Punic War stories, Scipio was involved in, or Scipio Africanus was involved in the Second Punic War. So Polybius gets involved in this, he gets to know some of the major characters, and he also travels around with these Roman generals when they're on military campaigns. So he's an excellent source for Roman history. Purpose in writing history. So what I've given you here is a piece of his work, and this is Book 1, Chapter 1. And what you might want to do is just turn the video off and then read through this. So what you can see is he says, "For certainly mankind possesses no better guide to conduct than the knowledge of the past." Than the knowledge of the past. So history for him is extremely important. I also put a note here down at the bottom that for Polybius, history was not used for entertainment. It was used as a guide to prepare you for an public or an office in the public. In terms of sources he uses, he thinks that it's better to actually talk to people, and to talk to people who are involved in what he was writing about. It's sort of unclear whether he used documentary evidence at this point. Certainly the later Roman historians have access to written documents and inscriptions and so on. It's unclear whether Polybius has this. We do know that he definitely read another historian named Timaeus, because I had you read Book 12 of his histories, and Book 12 is nothing but really an attack on Timaeus, who wrote a history. We also know that he read a historian named Theopompus, and again, we don't have very much information on Theopompus's writings except for what later Roman historians have to say. And then we know that Polybius traveled around. I just mentioned he was friends with the Scipio family and went on military campaigns with them. Okay, and what I have here is something that you probably wouldn't pick up in the readings that I gave you from Polybius. But what I've done is I've looked at a book by someone written by a man named Brysock, and he wrote a book called Historiography. And on page 47, he describes a little bit of the chronology found in Polybius. And what you'll notice here is that Polybius tends to see sort of a circular evolution of human government. And what Polybius tends to look at is at the beginning, you've got something that is called pre-civilization, where you've got one person ruling, and the government is really despotism. And Polybius thinks that what normally comes out of this is monarchy, which for him is the first form of government, and mono means one, and then in Greek, arch, A-R-C-H, means ruler. So monarchy is literally one ruler. For Polybius, monarchy always corrupts into tyranny, and then out of tyranny comes aristocracy, which is another Greek word, and it means the best. So aristocracy is the rule of the best. Aristocracy moves into, or is corrupted into, oligarchy, which is the rule of a few. And then for Polybius, oligarchy changes into democracy, which then always moves into mob rule. And then mob rule goes back to the very beginning here, which is pre-civilization. So the reason I want to give you that is because if you tend to read all of someone's writings, and in this class I've only given you little chunks, sometimes you can see these cycles. And what that means is it can help you understand the way that Polybius is writing history, or other historians are writing history, because they tend to place this template on top of their history writing. Excuse me. It turns to the question about divine or supernatural in human history. You do see Polybius like earlier historians before him, like the Greeks, moving away from this idea that the gods and goddesses are ruling, are controlling people. You get this idea of fortune or fate in Roman historiography, where it almost sounds like things are set in place and that's the way they're supposed to happen. But you don't see a lot of this in the writing of Polybius. Okay, moving on to the next historian that I had you read, and that was Sallust, and I've given you his date here. I've given you here a large chunk of his purpose for writing history, and what I'd like you to do is to turn off the video and read through this, this quote. Okay, and what I've done here too is I've given you another large quote about why he's writing history. And this is taken from book 4, section 2. So why don't you turn off the video and then read through that. In terms of the supernatural, again, you can see Sallust talking about fortune or fate. And here's just another quote. And as you can see, we're moving through this fairly quickly. So we're moving on to Livy, the rise of Rome. Livy's a little bit different than the historians we've looked at because he has no political experience and no military experience. Livy came to the notice of Augustus, the first emperor, and Augustus sort of took him under his wing, and then Livy wrote his histories. What's kind of interesting about this is that Augustus read Livy's The Rise of Rome, and actually corrected some of it. So Livy had to go back and rework some of his history. If you look at the themes in Livy's writings, he's looking at the difference between the Republic, which again, according to tradition, started in 509 BC, and then down to the Empire, which is starting from the time of Augustus. In general, Livy thought that the older period was better, and again, this is a trend or a theme that you see in a lot of Roman historians. And again, the same theme here, decline in morality. So people were more moral at the very beginning of Roman history. And okay, in terms of his purpose, I've given you here another quote, and what you might want to do is stop the video and read through this. In terms of his sources, he writes some of the ancient history of the Romans, and what he tends to do is base his history on tradition. So what he does is he looks at some of the written sources for ancient Roman history. He certainly has access to some written text, and I mentioned that we weren't quite sure if this was the case for Polybius, and he also uses earlier historians like Polybius. In terms of the supernatural, I've given you here at least one quote from 1.4. He talks about fates or fortune, mention of fortune again. He talks about portents, and 155 he talks about a snake. He sort of distrusts the belief in the gods and how they might be working in terms of history. Last thing I do want to mention is I want to make sure that you really think about the way that Polybius and Lucian are telling us to write history. So this is something we did in class, and it's something that I've had you do online in the discussion board. But make sure that you read through again Polybius book 12 and then Lucian, and compare and contrast how they do their history writings.